right, back here on the Metal Command podcast, talking about bands shooting themselves in the foot before their career can begin. So, not long ago, I was on a podcast called Heavy Business. It is a podcast hosted by Curtis Dewar, who is a really good publicist that works for a lot of heavy metal labels and, of course, independent bands. And it's also hosted by Justin Roth, who plays in the band War Curse and who also does work in a lot of different areas of the music business, including merchandising, doing road work and management work like he did for Exodus and Exhorder, and does some work for Obituary. Really cool dude, really cool bunch of guys, actually, that host that podcast. And I went on there to talk about some of the communication issues between publicists and journalists. And one of the things that I talked about was, when you write a publicist, and it doesn't matter how big or how small the podcast is, a lot of people won't get a response, or the journalist will say, yeah, we're going to set up some interview dates, and then it never happens. And we talked about this communication problem. And one of the things I brought up was the fact that these publicists just, when I go and talk to them, they say they're going to set something up, and it never happens. For most people, usually what they'll do is they'll say, hey, we're going to have a day or two where we are going to set up interview dates. Then it never happens. And a lot of that is on the publicist who are promoting some of these bands that are basically just not doing their job. Okay. Curtis is definitely a guy that does his job, but he did point out one thing to me that I never really thought about. And he said something really interesting to me. And one of the things that he brought up to me was the fact that there are bands out there right now who are just starting out. They might have a couple thousand followers, and they think that they should automatically be getting huge interviews with, websites like Metal Sucks and Loudwire, some of these big media entities within the heavy metal scene. And they think and feel entitled to that right out of the gate. And folks, I'll be honest with you, it doesn't work like that. You have to kind of build up your fan base for anyone at any of these sites to really have any interest or even care about what you have going on. And so I'm going to play you this segment of what Kurt said to me, because I thought it was interesting when I brought up the fact that we were talking about younger bands or newer bands, basically kind of blowing off interviews, and, bands that are like, publicists aren't getting back to a lot of people. So check this interview clip out. You'll see what I mean. Here you go.
Publicists seem to be, especially prone to bad communication, right? But also at the same time, I think it is an issue with gatekeeping. So unless I misunderstood you, you were saying that a lot of times a publicist just won't get back to you about available dates for a band, correct?
Yes, and it's always typically with newer or younger bands.
So here's the issue that I've run into, just so you know. A lot of times, the worst bands to set up an interview with are newer bands or bands that are not touring. A lot of those bands tend to have an inflated sense of importance at times. Not all of them, obviously, but there's a good chunk. Justin, no, just kidding. But we've actually, the most difficult bands I've ever worked with tend to be the ones that aren't signed. And I'm generalizing right now, because that's obviously not the case with the vast majority of our clients. I'm saying past, there is no one current. But the only times I've really had difficulties with bands for scheduling interviews has been newer or unsigned bands, because they automatically think they should only be getting Decibel, Metal Injection, Metal Sucks, Revolver, Loudwire. They're paying $1,000. That's what they should be getting, right? Plus, you've worked PR for Halloween, you've worked with Orden Ogan, you guys should be getting us all this shit. It's just not the case. They're new.
Right.
And it doesn't matter what publicist they hire. They could hire someone at $6,000 a month. Revolver's not going to fucking take you if you're under DBVP, unless you're like the super hot new thing, like a Bad Omens type or something like that. Commercial appeal up the ass, and you got friends at Revolver or something like that, right? So that's could be the case what's happening with you. I don't know, but I do know that almost all the time with like there is a subsection of bands that are like that. They think that they're paying for PR. They should automatically be getting only big things. And if you set them up with something mid-size or smaller, even like sometimes if you say like we got an interview with you for a site like, let's say for example Lamb Goat, which is pretty big. Well, that's not Metal Sucks. I'll only talk to sites like Metal Sucks, Pitchfork, Stereo Gum, and it's like, it's just not gonna fucking happen, dude. And then they get mad at you later because they didn't get the type of PR that they wanted, they didn't get results, but meanwhile, you've tried to set them up and they got like, with 30 interviews and they all said no, or they wouldn't answer the written interviews and stuff like that. So,
yeah,
I think a lot of times that's the case, and I'm not saying that's in every instance.
All right, so that was Curtis Dewar talking about how bands feel entitled, bands that are just starting out, maybe have 1,000 or a couple thousand followers, putting out their first album, thinking they deserve all these big interviews from all these big websites, when in fact these sites have no interest in them whatsoever because nobody knows who they are. So bands that this applies to, if this applies to you, and for whatever reason, I don't know why, but anytime I've ever encountered this, it has always been an American power metal band. And I always thought that to be interesting because power metal has never really taken off here in the States. It's more of a European thing and a Japanese thing and a South America thing. But it's been a lot of younger, new power metal bands from the US that seem to act like this. So I have some advice for those of you that this applies to. You are a new band. You might have under 4,000 followers. It is your first album. You don't have much of a fan base. You have to build that fan base up, and you have to build it from the bottom up. So if you are a new band, I'm going to be quite honest with you. If you want to basically build that fan base from the bottom up, what you have to do is go on as many of these shows as you can. It doesn't matter if that show has 2 followers or half a million. The reason I say that is no matter how big that show is, that host is going to tell 10 to 20 of their friends about your band. There are people that might listen to your album, that want you on their podcast, who are really into your band. And when you go on that podcast, let's say that podcast gets 20 views, right? That's 20 people that saw the podcast that checked out your band. If they like it, they're going to tell 10 or 20 more people about your band. And then you'll notice the followers will start to go up. And as the followers on your pages, whether it's Facebook or YouTube or whatnot, as that following starts to grow, people then start taking notice. And the bigger that fan base gets, the more people take notice. So the point that I'm making is that you have to earn your way up the ladder, folks. You can't just think, I put a record out and I'm entitled to all this exposure from all these big websites and screw everybody else that isn't Loudwire, Metal Sucks, or any of these websites that have a huge following and get thousands of hits every day. Doesn't work like that. You know what does work, though? Word of mouth. People posting your music on Facebook. If someone has a podcast and they post that podcast with your interview on it and some details about your band, let's say they got a couple hundred friends on Facebook, there might be 20 people that'll like it, and then they will spread the word. And that is how it works. This notion that, on your debut EP or album that you are going to get all this, exposure and that you're suddenly a rock star, it just doesn't work like that. And a lot of these bands, they feel entitled to that. I see it all the time. There was a band, I'm not going to name who they are. They had probably 300 followers on Facebook. And I'm not going to even tell you who the publicist is. But they put an album out there. It was actually somewhat decent. And I listened to it. I thought it was pretty good. But then they went on a rant about how publicists do nothing for you. Well, if you are a band and a publicist offers you like 25 interviews and you turn them all down because they aren't one of these huge rock websites or YouTube channels, that is on you. That is not on the publicist. Now, I've ranted in the past on the Facebook page, for example, about how there's a lot of publicists, some of which have been around a long time, that do not do their job. However, there are bands out there right now who are the problem and not the publicist. And what Curtis talked about in that video you just saw is exactly what I'm talking about when it comes to that. Now, if you want a success story when it comes to creating hype, if you want a success story of where I just saw my entire social media feed saturated with a band, let's talk about Flotsam and Jetsam. The new album is my album of the year right now. They did interviews with as many people as they could. The publicist, Dustin, who works for AFM Records, did a phenomenal job. But it takes the publicist and the band to make that happen. And it happened. I mean, I couldn't tell you how many interviews I saw. And Flotsam did interviews with people that have a podcast with 200 followers to huge websites. And it was saturated. And literally for the last 2 months, that's almost all I've seen in my social media feed. That is the way to do it. Flotsam and Jetsam by far is not one of the biggest thrash bands out there. I'll tell you what, they put out, in my opinion, my album of the year, but they aren't as big as Testament. They don't have as big of an audience as Slayer or Kerry King or whatnot. But I guarantee you, they increased their fan base quite a bit. Now, granted, this is a band that's been around for close to, about 40 years or pretty close to it. But at the same time, they did did interviews on podcasts with everybody they could. That is the attitude that a new band should have. Do as many podcasts. Get your name out there, saturating the internet as much as you can. And I can pretty much tell you the fan base will grow. So new bands, don't feel entitled. Work your butt off. You start it from the bottom up, from the ground up, I guarantee you will gain a following. I've watched it happen for 25, 26 years, however long I've done this show now. And that's what I have for you as far as my advice. With that said, check out the Heavy Business podcast. Really cool thing. It mainly talks about the business aspect of the music industry, and it's actually pretty insightful, some of the things that get talked about. And I was really happy to be on. So thanks to Justin and Kurt for having me on. Hey, everybody. Tony here from the Metal Command podcast. Again, I appreciate your support. Since 1998, I have hosted this show in one form or another, starting off in radio and now in the podcast format. Again, thanks for watching. And if you like what you see and hear on this show, by all means, please hit the subscribe button, hit the little bell to be notified anytime I do post a video. And if you see this program on any other form of social media, please give me a follow there. Again, I always appreciate your support.